Good morning. And well, I guess it's probably afternoon in many parts of the world. Thank you for coming. Today's webinar from the EstesGroup will be on cloud migration stories. I wanted to introduce Chris Koppler from our team. Chris is our director of sales, and he has a lot of firsthand knowledge as to the trials and tribulations of a cloud migration. Now, the idea of talking about the stories, a lot of folks come to us sometimes looking for a roadmap for implementing a cloud-based ERP strategy. Others come to us just looking more for anecdotal information to understand how an implementation went and what some of the challenges were, and try to get a sense of kind of a benchmark and engage their business relative to the other customers that are out there. So today we're going to do the latter and focus just on some of the stories of some other customers who migrated their enterprise systems and related architectures to the cloud. And we will be kind of using that as a fodder for discussion. Please, there are Q&A enabled in the webinar. So at any point, raise any questions. Chris and I will be kind of doing this together, and Chris will be jumping in, adding color commentary as things come along. And I will go ahead here and start my screen, and we will have our conversation. All right, so today's session is on cloud migration stories and some of the stories we have seen from our customers, how things went, reasons for moving to the cloud, and some of the results and outcomes that came from that journey, and the individual challenges along the way. So really, every cloud migration is its own unique story. We think of people that have common ERP systems. Quite often those systems are implemented in vastly different ways, have different integrations, different versions, and that makes every implementation of a cloud-based solution a real story unto itself. And sometimes it's a horror story. And I hear folks talking to us about past challenges. When we talk to a customer about cloud, quite often they're hesitant because of past challenges that either they experienced firsthand or heard from someone else with regard to expectations that weren't met, the massive change that came across, getting overwhelmed with scope, not being able to know exactly what they're doing because they didn't document, managing all the integrations that are covered in such a thing, getting the system actually tested correctly to know that it wouldn't blow up at go live, working with all the partners, integration partners, to make the configuration of the new system work, and then just having the basic expertise to make it happen. So there's a lot of challenges to a cloud migration that can make a simple story a horror story. And maybe helpful real quick to talk a little bit about some of the terminology that is involved in this kind of transition. I think of really four kinds of cloud when we talk about, or maybe deployment model is probably a better way of putting it. When you talk about the basic types, we often find ourselves in an on-premise environment where you have the servers located on-premise, you have some hardware footprint that you're maintaining, and all of that ownership and responsibility is on you as a customer. Another version of cloud-based solutions would be a private cloud. Here you have an on-premise-like situation, except it's built in a data center. So you have a data center-based solution that is cut off from other customers, which is a good thing. I think the public cloud creates a lot of challenges potentially with cross commingling and the risks involved, but you really have a nice self-contained unit in which you can deploy your application and have a full control and access that comes with that kind of deployment. A more genericized version of cloud might be considered software as a service, where you no longer have that control and access of the server installation. Rather, you're consuming a software over the web as a service without that underlying access and control. And to be honest, almost every environment we run into these days is some form of a hybrid cloud, which is a combination of private cloud, on-premise applications, software as a service applications. Every application you implement has a different deployment model potentially, and meshing and blending those is what we call a hybrid cloud. And pretty much often you implement that hub. And in our business, we implement private cloud as the hub ERP system at the center of the wheel of integrations. But each of those integrations can in turn be one of many formats in terms of their own deployment. And kind of understanding that as a baseline makes for a helpful conversation as we delve in. Because as a customer, you're going from one to another. You might be going from an on-premise into one cloud version, be it a SaaS or a private cloud. You might be shifting from a private cloud to private cloud. I'd say a fair percentage of our own customers were once in a private cloud that was hosted by their vendor, and at some point they decided to shift away from the vendor and move into our hosted solution. And we even get customers who are coming to us from SaaS, trying to understand whether there would be value in moving off of the SaaS platform, usually due to functionality limitations, failed expectations, lack of control and access that they need to run their application. And they come to us looking to do this inside of a private cloud because of those things. So the path of where you're going to and where you're coming from are really important here. And to that end, I wanted to give you a couple of examples of companies that were migrating to a private cloud solution and kind of talk through the story of each of them so that you get an understanding of these are the challenges that we came into it, and these are the things that happened to us as a course of the migration, and this were the outcomes. So I have one company, I'm going to call them Company A for now, and we have some references. If you ever want to follow up with us and talk about these customers or talk to them in more detail, we could definitely introduce them. But for now, I'm going to genericize them. And our first customer here, we call a Company A supplier in the construction market. They were moving from an on-prem solution into a private cloud. And really, they were doing this in order to replace their existing aging hardware and mitigating some of the risks of their current platform. We'll go into what some of those were, because those ended up being things that we had to address as part of this implementation. From an ERP standpoint, they were doing a bit of a migration as well. So you think that a migration is not only a hardware migration or an operating system, it might also involve the software itself might be upgraded or migrated. And here we're moving from the desktop version of a Profit 21 ERP to its web version. So there was kind of an extra layer there of change management. Now, in terms of the new build, we'll talk a little bit about this, the idea of when you migrate a company to a solution in the cloud, you can do one of two paths. You can do what we call a lift and shift, where you basically take a snapshot of your existing server environment and shift them, drop them into a cloud environment, or a build from scratch model, where you rebuild that environment from the bottom up. And depending on kind of the needs of the business, this company in question was looking to kind of upgrade their entire platform. You might have to find yourself as doing a build from scratch. And that's what this was. We had a new build with new middleware and app servers and new domain controllers. This was important too. We often don't underscore the importance of multiple domain controllers when you implement a cloud solution, that you keep the domain controller for your backup and disaster recovery separate from the domain controller that you use in production, because that's a common path for malware and ransomware to try to sneak through a common domain controller. Now, what we found with this implementation, they had a very complex hybrid cloud environment, a super large number of integrations, and some even homegrown integrations. So you had homegrown software, you had third parties, and a lot of them were very much undocumented. They were in the minds of the developers who had developed them, or the original people who had implemented them. And in many cases, some of those people were no longer with the company. And so as a result, that integration architecture was not documented, and some of those third-party vendor relationships who were supplying, integration, the integrations themselves, those relationships were not active. They had atrophied, so that the communication lines, because there was really no need, because the integrations were working adequately, were no longer in place. And because they had a small team, the project lost a key resource during the duration of the migration, which created some interesting challenges to the organization, which kind of underscored some of the reasons that they were moving to the cloud, was to try to mitigate some of those challenges losing individuals. I think Chris would verify with me that one of the biggest reasons we see customers coming to us looking for cloud services is that their ERP admin or their system admin is actually retiring, and they want to they don't want to try to force in SaaS at the 11th hour. They want to hand this system over to someone who can maintain it for their company, but they find themselves in need to do that due to retirement. So we find a lot of attrition for, one of many reasons, due to illness. Of course, in the COVID world where we're in right now, that's not uncommon, due to just job changes and the change management that happens when you're shifting to cloud, that sometimes people start brushing up their resumes as a result. And then, of course, with retiring resources, replacing them can be a real challenge.
So yeah, I was going to say, Brett, I had something to add to that, just to
Sure.
that subsection about lifting and shifting or doing a new build. I would say that there's not really a right or wrong way from what I've seen in the industry of which one works better. It's really dependent upon each business. As you mentioned specifically with this company, we did do a new build, which sometimes is a little bit of a longer process, but you have a tendency to clean out your closet, so to speak, and find out that those integrations, those relationships, some of those bad configurations, you get a flush through and are forced to flush through, which is really good for a lot of organizations, because a lot of it does end up in that tribal knowledge space where resources have moved on. It's been long enough since the initial integration that maybe things weren't configured or set up correctly. And so now it's kind of a chance to basically do new. It's not without its own hurdles. Like this specific company had those issues because they didn't have some of those vendor relationships configured. And the alternative, like you mentioned, doing a lift and shift is a much faster methodology if you're looking to do a quicker implementation. However, you're basically just mirroring what you have on site up into the cloud. So any of those bad configurations or possible discovery aha moments that you would have between the customer and them kind of realizing, oh, we don't know what we don't know, don't necessarily happen during that shift and can sometimes be a little bit problematic down the road. So like you said, there's not a right or wrong reason, but there's definitely a different kind of integration path depending on what fits best for you, whether it's timeline and resources, or whether it's you have that kind of, I guess, timeline, timetable, and want to make sure you're doing best practices might guide you down either one of those paths.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think definitely in this case with the customer, to mitigate the risks that they had in front of them, a lift and shift wouldn't have been the best path. That the path they took might have been a little more complex, but definitely I think the outcome definitely justified the effort. And so in terms of the outcomes, Estes, we worked with various vendors as a part of this. One of the key elements of this cutover was to re-engage the vendor community and kind of assist with those integration platforms to make sure we were doing them correctly and up to date. Now, one of the challenges, of course, you run into here is that some integrations might themselves have new versions, and that if you upgrade your hardware platform and your operating system, you might find yourself in need of updating that integration. We found some of that there. We really found varying levels of support in the vendor community. And I think that goes back to some of our lessons learned. Really important to keep those relationships established as you get them so that they don't atrophy. You don't find yourself on the hook missing shipments or what have you. Really took a lot of effort to get the integrations over the finish line, because we did a lot of unraveling of some of the integrations, even the custom solutions, to understand just how they function so that we could connect them correctly again. And that took a fair bit of time and money to get everything where it needed to be, because of the reasons we said, that it was a build from scratch, in addition to a lot of reverse engineering to get it into a full configured ecosystem. But as a result, I think there's a lot of really positives that came out, because we now have everything documented, all the integrations, their connection strategies. I'm sure any of you who worked in integrations know that you could be integrating at the ODBC level, or you might be integrating over a REST service passed over the web, and everything in between. So it's really important that you have all those documented. And as a function of this process, we were able to document those integrations, clean up a lot of processes as a function of the rollover. And ultimately, it resulted in a happy customer that met the original goals of the project: mitigate the risks, move to an up-to-date platform, kind of solidify the organization and provide a foundation for it going forward. Anything else on this customer, Chris, that you noted as kind of an outcome after all was said and done with them?
The only other really outcome that was somewhat challenging during this migration that had to be worked through is moving from an on-prem environment to a private cloud environment such as ours. It's the infrastructure is very similar to what you have on premise. So the servers, the architecture, the network access, VPNs, internet tunnels are all very familiar to organizations that are looking to make this move. It's a much simpler data network transfer and overall solution to implement than moving from on-prem to SaaS, where you have to do a lot of conversion. So that was the only other real challenge that we had with them is they had a lot of VPN tunnels set up because they had many sites across the US. And so during this implementation, we had to do a little bit of cleanup of how do we restructure that organization, because effectively their business application was moving from location A to location B. So keep that in mind as you look to see timeline, timetables, and resources that you have to kind of throw at these migrations and implementations, is so that networking will also be not a mountain that's impossible to climb, but something to keep in mind.
Very good. So let's talk about Company B. Company B had some different dynamics and makes for another kind of complementary story to talk through. This was a company in the industrial supply chain area, and they were again moving from an on-prem to a private cloud. From a goal standpoint, I think the biggest challenge here was not so much supportability and risk mitigation as it was scalability. Company in growth, looking to replace their existing server architecture so that they had something that was more scalable versus just piling on more hardware. In this case, we did a little bit of a different approach. We did the lift and shift here, where we took their existing platform en masse and moved it into the cloud, which meant the same version of the ERP came along with it for the ride. That made for, I would say, a faster architectural shift. I think probably compared to the previous customer, they were not as far behind in terms of the updates to their application. So it was an easier thing to lift and shift because they weren't trying to catch up at the same time. Built a very similar architecture with the main controllers and the middleware app servers. They had, like the first customer, a large integration platform, but they also had a much larger team, internal and a vendor team that could support this. They had a very broad relationship network built with their vendors for each of these third parties, so that the integrations were relatively easy to make, and the customer themselves were able to do many of them. Now, Chris, tell me about this. We talk a lot about infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service, and this was an interesting kind of example of kind of the dimensions along that parallel, where as an infrastructure as a service provider, we were able to stand up the hardware, but the customers really wanted to own much more of the management of the applications than they did in Company B. And tell me a little bit about some of the opportunities that come with that dynamism.
Yeah, so we really have, I would say in this space, we really have three options that fit well for customers. We have a purely infrastructure as a service play, which was very much how this company was set up. We were involved heavily in the implementation, the migration, the testing and configuration of their integrations to make sure everything was running smoothly. And then we turned the keys of the kingdom over, so to speak, and basically let them have full access to the environment. Now, we designed it to where we have, they still have additional support through us if need be, so they can reach out and submit tickets as required for additional support. That seemed to work really well for them, as they had a pretty big team and could manage most of the servers and the environment. They have reached out to us as they after we got this implementation off the ground, and they did double in footprint size from the initial kind of scope. And we see that's quite common for a lot of organizations, is once they find a cloud and they find a migration strategy that works and they have access to their network, they just want to move over more pieces because it makes sense. So in that case, they basically started doing that, moved some of the some servers that weren't in the original kind of ERP environment up to our cloud as well. Now, they've later reached out and said, hey, we don't really have like SQL DBAs on staff that resource has left and moved on, and have set up basically a management contract for us to manage just a piece of their environment, even though they still have full access, and we don't necessarily restrict that. So that's really kind of the infrastructure as a service model, that seems to work very, very well for organizations that have a decent sized footprint. We have really platform as a service, which is basically managed ERP. So we pick their brains. We're involved with them in the migration, the standing up the solution, and the testing. But when it comes to the day-to-day, the Windows updates, managing if there's slowness or if there's any tweaks that need to be made in that ERP environment on the infrastructure side, we manage that on a daily basis. They still have full access to the environment, which a lot of organizations like. We don't restrict it one way or another. It just means that they're not necessarily on the hot seat, so to speak, for the day-to-day operations of managing that environment and infrastructure. And then we have a little bit of a hybrid model, as I like to call it, to where it's infrastructure as a service, to where they manage the environment, but we have a little bit of a support model package included, which works really, really well as well. So if they're doing a new server build, something that they might want to just offload, they have that support model. And it's all inclusive, so it's not divided out for time and materials, or here's a project, there's a project. It's just kind of included, but they primarily manage the environment. So those are the really three models that we see deployed in our cloud solution for ERP, and everyone works different for different organizations. Some large organizations say, I want to focus on where my business is going next and other projects and turn the keys of the kingdom over. Others like to retain more of that control, and that's what they view their internal resources is, to manage those environments. So we're configured to kind of help out every organization, ones that don't have the resources, ones that have fully fleshed out resources, or ones that just want to offload that work so they can focus on other business aspects.
Nice. Very good. So let's move from here to the outcomes in this case. So in this case, the cutover event was very successful. We had tremendous on-hand support for go live. The customer, for their part, was organized and prepared and highly available, which is huge for one of these large, complex cutovers, because you really have to think, if you have a ERP system, a platform, and all the integrations, you might be cutting over 10 to 20 distinct elements. And so each of those elements could potentially fail independently and require a support. And that support needs to be really broad. So that worked out extremely well. We ran into one interesting challenge, where some of the integrations, you might run into these with companies that are single license and single box applications where you can run it in prod, but you cannot run it in a test environment. And then there are other ones that just are constructed where, let's assume an EDI can be hard to test because it's actually sending transactions to a given customer. So testing some of these in isolated cloud environments was difficult. So we needed to have to do some of those at go live itself to make sure that everything was falling in, and you were doing kind of a live testing model, which required some rapid response in order to make sure to catch any challenges that happened before cutover weekend and the full user community's back. We had a big team of third-party contacts prepared and scheduled for go live. And I'd say I'd recommend this to anybody who's considering such a thing, is to make sure to have your third party know what you're doing and when, so that they're able to respond should you have to pick up the bat phone and send them a call. So one thing I would say generally here, that the cutover was tremendously smooth. The customer migrated successfully and was poised for the kind of growth that they were anticipating. And to Chris's point, they were able to grow their footprint very quickly to support the needs of the business. Now let's quickly jump into one more example here. This example is my company C. And so while our first two implementations here were largely successful, this one I wanted to add is a bit more of a cautionary tale, because it surfaces kind of some of the challenges that a company comes into that should really determine when you're ready to move into cloud, and kind of your expectations for how you should address it. Now, this was a company, a maker, a distributor of supply of fasteners to multiple markets, and they were similarly moving again from on-prem to private. The biggest challenge they had in their current world, it was funny enough that their conference room, one of the guests at the table in the conference room was actually the server. And funny enough, the server was located directly under a sprinkler system. So if they were ever in a case where I don't know, someone was cooking in the conference room, they could potentially toast their server, or maybe not toast, more like flood. So they had the kind of textbook case of why you should try to get that thing out of your conference room and into the cloud. Um, they themselves had a very simple integration platform, basically a faxation and FedEx. They were looking to do dual projects and do the ERP migration as part of Office 365 and get all of their on-premise Microsoft functionality migrated to the cloud as well. And they had bundled this activity, this ERP version upgrade, with the overall migration. And so, based on those circumstances, we ran into a couple of outcomes that made the project extend almost indefinitely. One was management mandate that the two projects happen serialized and not in parallel. So the 365 migration happened before the ERP, which drew out the ERP migration significantly. On top of that, when we got to the point where we started the migration, testing itself proved to be a major hurdle. I don't think we can underestimate the importance of testing. It's definitely in an environment where you have a lot of integrations, definitely an environment where you are doing a build from scratch and every kind of layer needs to be retested. But there's kind of another layer, which is the functional testing, to make sure that this business system operates as you intend and as you expect, and make sure that that happens before you cut over and go live. Getting over that hurdle was significant. Mostly because they had internal bandwidth limitations. They didn't have the time and availability to test as much as they wanted to. And this coupled with some internal conflicting priorities that said this migration was less important than some other things that had come up. The project extended indefinitely. So we're still in the process of getting these folks over the finish line. It really goes to underscore, I think, some of the strategic challenges you want to consider when you jump into a cloud migration, and make sure that this is the right time and that you're not going to have those conflicts come in and pull you back. Else you might find yourself doing a lot of wheel spinning, and that wheel spinning most often is lost time, lost revenue, lost costs spent in a partially implemented environment. That can create a lot of challenges for companies. So all of that said, there are certain lessons learned when we get into a migration strategy here. And just wanted to cover some of these that we've learned here across this project and some of our others. Is you really want to understand the baggage that comes along with a migration, because it's often much more than you've anticipated. These include like the technical elements. There are plenty of things there to think about in terms of, do you want to match the physical properties of your existing server in terms of CPU, RAM, and disk? That can have cost implications. Are you currently overbuilt or underbuilt? And what's the right blend there? Simple things like your operating system licenses might change as a function of Microsoft changes from moving from one system to another that you need to consider. Not to consider like your endpoint security, your backup and disaster recovery solutions. There are a lot of pieces to this puzzle that you really need to think about in order to make sure that the whole system shifts and that you don't break anything in that transition. And I haven't really even started talking about all your integrations, because those tend to be the biggest challenge once you've established your technical foundation. Now, all of these integrations that sit on top of that, and you can see that's probably a common thread today that we're talking about. There are a lot of different ones, and during discovery, quite often we'll start the meeting and the customer will believe they have 3 integrations. And then as we go through the question, well, do you have anything special for shipping? Do you have anything special for label printing? Or do you have a quality management system? And we realize, if they go in thinking they have 3, they come out realizing they have 10. So quite often those integrations sort of blend in with the background, and you figure out that you actually have more than you anticipate. Another point here, and this was key with one of our instances, was understanding your vendors. The better you understand your vendors, the easier time you're going to have in configuring and integrating that new system. So it's really advised that you re-engage them or work with your provider to re-engage them prior to a migration, because that'll shorten the amount of time you spent, the amount of investment you have, and the amount of risk, honestly. And so as we talk about risks, I think there's, and this, like Chris had talked a little bit about the idea of lift and shift versus build from scratch. Each of those comes with, collective decisions and implications that really need to be considered up front. And this also has to do with if you're going to bundle upgrade as part of your migration. The bigger scope you intend to have generally means you'll have a bigger risk and a bigger challenge to get over the hurdle. So you need to know as an organization, are we the kind of organization that gets over these hurdles in the past, or do those things tend to be really challenging? Because then, the more you found your organization is challenged by those big high scope activities, you might want to try to find to do ways to bite off chunks and do things incrementally. Maybe wait to shift over into your new system before upgrading your ERP. Maybe try a lift and shift instead of a build from scratch, and then fine tune what you have. Maybe find ways to keep certain components as they were and move and advance other components. Try to mitigate the things that could stop this project from being successful. And one is probably the idea that internal understanding is of the touch points and the details. And the vendors, of course, can be helpful with this with all of your integrations, but understanding those very well out of the gate is hugely important, because it saves you that time spent reverse engineering things and trying to get out of trying to get an understanding built from scratch when you could have that potentially understood ahead of time, and really plan for those homegrown applications in addition to third parties. We spent a lot of time talking about third parties. A lot of companies end up with homegrown apps, and you need to plan for those because those end up being a little bit different. We've had cases where applications are hard coded to an IP address. You actually need to find the source code, modify that. Ideally, you find a way to turn that into something more like a config file versus a hard coded value, but whatever you can to try to repoint those things. Now, Chris, this was one that I think you mentioned as an important one, the idea of attrition. So we lose a lot of tribal knowledge when people leave the company. I think that's really something you need to plan for in terms of mitigating the possibilities that it happens, because I think there's a certain amount of understood attrition where we'll start a project and one of the network admins feels like this project might be challenging to him and his job and his role. So he or she might find themselves looking outside very quickly. So bridging that gap early, preferably ahead of time, is really, I think, a big benefit to companies. Now,
I was going to say, I've got something I could add there, Brad.
Sure.
So one of the biggest things is I've seen quite a few integrations that we've done where it's just bad timing. So they've had basically their application specialist, whether it's illness, whether they get a different job offer, whether they have family matters that come up, but they're just completely off the grid. And these are functionally the people that understand the application and all the nuances of how the application is leveraged for your business. My recommendation is, whether or not you're looking at a cloud migration, the easiest way is, if you have somebody that understands the application layer right now, create an internal document of how would we test our application if we are going to do an upgrade or move it to a new location and basically stand it up. You don't even have to do the migration. You can have that conversation today and build yourself an internal checklist of, here is the nuances from the expert that works in the application, that it is that tribal knowledge, to basically get it as almost a standard operating procedure checklist of, this is how we would retest if we were going to a new environment, doing an upgrade, or things that we need to look out for. That's my tip of the day is do that now. Don't wait until down the road. If you have that internal resource, whether you're looking at migrating or you're looking at upgrading, document that today, and it will make your life a lot easier down the road if you ever come to that migration, or you have just a shift of internal resources. At least you have that documentation and you have that checklist. It's invaluable.
No, for sure. Another point you had mentioned about IIS or IaaS was the importance of responsibility. And I found this with different customers. Sometimes we have to kind of level set expectations and understand that if a customer comes to us looking for kind of a bottom level IaaS in terms of they want a very stripped down solution, that the control and the responsibility for all those components goes to them And that if that's the case, we can certainly support that. We need to have a clear understanding, I think, of the responsibility aspect that comes with that. That if you want us to just stand up the base architecture, you work with the other pieces, that there's a lot that falls on you that you need to be ready to take on. And you need to, from the staffing standpoint, attrition and such, you got to have those bodies there to do it.
Correct. That is correct. I think we call them AORs, areas of responsibility, is the acronym, and then we like to throw around. It's very important to have that. Generally, a lot of customers will have that somewhat set up in their organization, but understanding that picture of when it moves to cloud and that shift is a great conversation to have. It is important knowledge to see who's responsible for the critical patches or the security. Now, to add to that, we do, with our solution, we do have the ability to sell in our tool set and let that company still manage the infrastructure. So we see that a lot as well in the industry. Is customers might, have a way to manage their on-prem servers. They'd still like to do that cloud, but they don't necessarily aren't equipped with that tool set of how do we monitor? How would we jump into a backup portal window? We can stand a lot of those solutions up and during that implementation, and then give the customer access to those tools to manage their own resources if that's something that they're interested in doing. So that's just another option. But I think that understanding of this is, as we do this shift, we might have been doing this before. Is that remaining the same, or is that shifting to a different type of model? That's very key and important to understand during those migration events.
No, that's great. And then you had already mentioned testing. I think that's a real great point of the importance of defining your test scripts and your testing method ahead of time. I'd add the big piece that I've seen as of importance is that idea of allocation of sufficient resources. And this involves testing. It involves a lot of areas. I mean, I was working with a customer just this week on a project that they were working on, and we were kind of going through the resource allocations in terms of staffing to staff the specific project we had. And they had at some point kind of one of those big wide-eyed moments that said, oh boy, I really am going to have to staff this in order to be successful. And I think that's kind of one of those moments that every project needs to have, to realize that, yeah, if we're going to get over the hurdle, this is what we need to invest to make that happen.
Correct. I will say that testing, testing. That is the number one thing that holds up almost every integration that is looking to make one of these shifts. If they have the internal resources and they've built that documentation of here's our internal checklist, they understand the testing process, generally speaking. That's why I'm saying work on that documentation now. I've dealt with quite a few integrations where timeline, they've got a tight window that they're looking to do this implementation. As long as they have the backend resources, we can hit almost anything that's set in front of us as far as realistic expectations from a migration standpoint. I've seen a lot of companies say, this is Q4, or we want to have this done at the end of Q3. And then they try to start the quoting, the scope of work, the entire project plan at the last minute, with a very limited time to make that migration, which can be done. The environment can be spun up and everything can have blinky lights turned on. However, the testing is always the delay. And so that will usually push any project that falls outside of the project timeline is due to those reasons, is there's not enough resources to test the internal processes. And they realize that after the fact, and they make the decision that they're not going to go live until that's tested, because that'd be like flipping on a production environment and then realizing that half the things that you greenlighted that said would work don't work. So usually you'll see most companies push out that timeline. So that's why I recommend, if cloud migrations in the future, or if it's something that's on your plate to do this year, to do for a certain time, double your time and give yourself that extra room. It just makes life easier. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have costs that double. It just means start that conversation, start the price shopping, starting the planning, starting all of that. And then as far as your implementation window, probably what you're expecting right now, I would almost put a 2 times multiplier on that. So if you think you want to do it in 60 days, I would give yourself at least 50% more. Give yourself 90 days for that implementation, and it's going to make your transition a lot easier in the long run.
No, that's fair to say. I like the point of the testing. Interesting enough, when I talk to our techs, and they tell me about times where things come through that can't be tested. I think the key there is a real good solid cutover plan that includes what your rapid response plan will be there, so that you know that even in those cases where you can't test, what you can do is you can check and double check your configurations to make sure that you minimize risk. But then also you have to plan to be really good at cutover to make sure that, if you need to pull in a vendor or a specialist or a technician on our team, that we have that all planned for ahead of time for these integrations that are only a day of cutover.
Correct. Yep. We do that a lot when we do migration events. Is we'll usually block multiple resources for that go live day, with the plan that's what you can't plan for, and there are things that you can't plan for when you do that final cutover, that you do have that rapid response. So that is great advice, Brad.
That there's interesting. I was in conversation with one of our technicians, and he used the term technical debt as a as a term for this migration process. And I love that term. It sounds kind of foreboding, but so when he was talking about technical debt, he was telling me as like the idea of like the costs and the issues that come out working with out-of-date hardware applications, operating systems, etc. That your platform gets out of date in various places at various rates, and then when you do something like a migration, you realize just the cost of not moving forward. So a migration sometimes can surface issues that you did not realize you had, just due to atrophy, just due to the fact that your platform is getting old, and you have kind of decision points to make as a function of this upgrade. Am I going to try to close that gap with the technical debt, or am I going to try to kick the can? And sometimes it makes great sense to kick the can, because you can only boil so big an ocean, but it's good to understand where that sits and where you actually are relative to kind of world-class up-to-datedness across your platform, because otherwise those are the things that quite often when I see with customers running into vendor issues, it's the cost of unsupported software that runs fine for now, but as soon as it breaks, suddenly the cost of its absence is huge to an organization. I think that's a big opportunity there to at a minimum understand your technical debt, and then try to figure out ways to close that gap as you go.
I will say that is a very fair, I guess, verbiage on how to look at that. I have seen a lot of implementations move forward with migrations. I've seen a lot of hurdles that have come up, that were unknowns. I have yet to see somebody that started an implementation that realized that from that technical debt, how much painful it would be if they didn't make that leap after they'd started that process. So I've yet to see a migration start and not conclude where they ended in the cloud, because I think it's very eye-opening that if you do run into those hurdles, they realize long-term for the business, going backwards is not the right answer. So I've never seen anyone make that step and then go the other direction. I've seen people pick platforms, where if they've looked at SaaS and they tried an implementation, it didn't necessarily work out because it's somewhat changing the back-end architecture of how your application is deployed. But I've never seen somebody that has tried to go to cloud and ran into those hurdles, not kept going. They might switch vendors, there might be some of that back end, but the principle of looking behind them and going, oh, wow, we didn't realize that we had to do X, Y, and Z and upgrade this and change this coding and those integrations. It's once they start that process, they see it through and generally are very happy on the end result.
Mm-hmm. So question for you, Chris. We're of course a cloud company, so by default, we're always looking to understand how an application can function in a cloud environment. But I think it's probably fair to say that not all applications or not all things are best put in a cloud. When you're talking to a customer, what's your best recommendation for how to try to understand whether or not something is a good fit for a cloud, or you might be actually better in your current state?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously, following on the sales side, I have a lot of conversations with a lot of different companies, and pretty transparent. Cloud lends very well, to organizations that are multi-site footprint. So they have multiple facilities, they have a remote workforce, they have a road warrior sales force. That's kind of, those are the organizations that work best for cloud. If you're coming from a single location, and you are looking at cloud, it might not be the best fit. Are there still reasons that would get you over that hurdle? Sure. But effectively, cloud is leveraged when you have a multi-user or site location environments. You don't have a single point of failure at that point. If you are on-prem, can you absolutely have an infrastructure with high availability, disaster recovery, and backups that can act as the cloud? Yes. The main issue that always comes back to is it depends on what your threshold for downtime is. If your threshold for downtime as an organization is basically zero, cloud will always be the option because you probably do not have generators, backup power, backup, multiple redundant internet circuits. Those all kind of fall in the cloud, which sometimes people don't think about. And so that's where I really try to lead customers. If you're a single site location, I'll talk to you about the benefits. And if the ROI is there, it might make sense to do cloud. You don't have to buy on-prem servers anymore. It's generally in a much more robust facility, such as our data center partner, that's ITAR compliant, NIST 800. They're working on CMMC. They hold a lot of certifications that would be not impossible to deploy on site, but very difficult to deploy on site. So those are some of the reasons that lend well to cloud from is this a right fit for my organization? If price is your deterring factor and that is what drives your company forward, cloud might not be the best option for you. ROIs have become much closer over the years. I would say 6 years ago, they weren't even in the same ballpark when you were talking about cloud ROI versus on-prem. Now they're much closer. You still have to take into account for, energy consumption, ingress, egress, things like that. But the ROIs have become much narrower to where it's almost the same when you're looking at solution to solution. Now, a part of that is our solution is very robust with the high availability clusters and things like that run. So is it a right fit for every organization? No, because it's not necessarily going to be the cheapest possible option if that's all you're looking for. So that's kind of how I help navigate customers through, is cloud the right fit for us? If you're looking to move your organization forward and you understand that technology can be leveraged for you, absolutely. If price is the sole thing that you buy on, it's worth taking a look at, but it might not be a slam dunk, and that's okay. Every organization structured differently. And I just try to be frank with customers is if it's not a good fit for you, I'm not going to try to push cloud upon you if it logically doesn't make sense for your business needs.
Right. Yeah, I found with the customers that I'm talking to, when I see them in a cost sensitive mode, we end up talking about colocation as an opportunity.
Right.
And that seems to be, I mean, if you're looking at the worst of all possible, least of all possible evils, I think you'd be going in the colocation route. Try to get that server out from underneath the sprinkler at a minimum, and
Right.
Mitigating some of those data center requirements. I mean, what I have seen with data centers is they all data centers seem to have a colocation aspect to them, and then a pure cloud aspect, and they certainly don't push away people who want to put their stuff inside of the cages, which makes a lot of sense. You take the cooling, the power redundancy, the physical security, all of those things you take and you remove. I mean, I had a customer who had I think this was in the Carolinas during the hot and muggy season. Their business went down just because the air conditioning in the entire building couldn't keep up with the heat. So this is kind of your obvious case to find a good local co-locator and plug it in there.
Sure.
I think I also see something with my some customers where individual applications are a bad fit to move into the cloud. Just because of the immediacy of them. I'm thinking like shipping applications seem to be a challenge across a lot of platforms where they have these really time-sensitive databases that are kind of constantly getting updated in the background, more like of a replication model, but they need to be right on premise so that the transaction can happen immensely quickly. And I find when these applications get moved off-site, the duration to print a shipping label or something tends to take a lot of time, a lot of wheel turning there. So I think when we're working with customers, we try more and more to go back to the vendor and say, okay, Mr. or Mrs. Vendor, we're trying to do this. Is this truly the best place to put this? Or do you find that this would work better in another configuration?
Sure.
This is obviously, time with vendors updating to REST APIs, that's a possibility there. As I guess everybody wants to sell their SaaS solutions, and then not always the best for the customer. So I guess we're probably looking at what the best decision is in terms of the key customer metrics like performance, reliability, downtime, all of those things. I guess downtime is a good question. I would, if you're a customer with bad internet access, and there are plenty of those that still exist in our infrastructure, probably a bad idea to move to cloud, whether it's SaaS or infrastructure as a service, if you're having a hard time consistently getting in and out. I had one customer, and this was actually when I was a customer. We had road construction, and the road crew was cutting through the concrete, and they cut down too far, and they cut through our pipe, and cut through our fiber pipe entering into the building. We were without internet for X amount of time as a result.
Sure.
Some folks have a worse situation where that pipe is never good. They're on, like, literally on the wrong side of the tracks, and the industrial parks infrastructure doesn't extend that far. You find yourself in a situation, yeah, you're probably best just installing that thing on premise and doing your best to manage that application locally.
Yep. No, we see that a lot. That's part of the discussion during the discovery is we kind of dive into what does their internet look like. On the flip side, I have had some customers where they have had a multi-site location. They had the application running obviously out of their main corporate office. The corporate office was the only one that had internet issues. And so it was almost inversed in that regard to where if they were cloud, it would have been a much better user experience for all of the remote locations. The primary location probably wouldn't have noticed any more interruption than they already did, because every time that they lost internet, functionally they could still pull everything, but all of the remote sites went down. And so it was something that was kind of funny, because that's the exact reason they were looking at cloud. Was they're saying we have these blips where we don't lose internet a lot. So the main location would just go out for a second, but it was long enough to literally take down all the remote sites, all the remote users. And if we would have flipped that, they would have had all remote sites wouldn't have had the interruption. The main site could have blinked, came back on, and pretty much not noticed any interruption at all. Right. And so it's interesting that sometimes internet can be the hurdle, and sometimes it can be looking at it the better solution. It just depends on the area that you're at and kind of how the environment's set up.
Right. So in a multi-site, as you had said earlier, a multi-site, one of the great benefits is that that distributed network allows you to have, one site could go down for whatever reason, and everyone else could be going. I know one of our customers had a situation where their on-premise hardware got hacked and ransomed, but their ERP system was still running because it was in our cloud, and that those connection points, the bad stuff didn't get in. So they were still able to at least transact in their ERP system while they were figuring out their on-premise version. So that's an interesting kind of correlate there.
Yep.
All right. So I'm looking here to see if we have any questions from our staff here, because we are getting pretty much to the end of our discussion. If we have any customer questions right away, this is certainly a good time to raise those, any from the attendee list here. So Chris, any other key pieces that you've thought of in terms of some of the stories of our customers' migrations that would be worth sharing or considering here?
I will say moving from SaaS to a private cloud is probably, it's not, the migration path is not difficult, but from a financial standpoint, that's one of the biggest hurdles that we see in the industry. Is if you're already SaaS and your licensing has changed, it is somewhat more difficult to move to an on-prem. It's not impossible to do. It just comes down to, are you having enough hurdles in SaaS to justify that cost to really look at that migration? The migration is very easy because it's just moving databases. The other thing that I see over time and time again is, for whatever reason, the SaaS model, I get a lot of discussions with companies about performance issues. And so that's one of the big things is, if you're looking at a migration event, I highly recommend, if you haven't ever made that leap, whether you use EstesGroup, which I would of course prefer that you do, look for an organization that can right size your environment. So that's probably one of the unique things about us, is we really do migrations. And as we mentioned earlier, the lift and shift, or the build new. The build new, we can right size from the get-go based on our expertise of, sometimes the ERPs out there say, here's the core specs to run this server. And it's very different on-prem than in a cloud environment. The resources are not necessarily created equal due to performance, speeds, the back-end network or architecture of how the clustered environments all link together. There's lots of components that go into that. If you decide to do a lift and shift to where we basically snap your existing resources and just put them up in the cloud, we can right size after the fact, which we see done quite frequently, to where you see some really beefy servers. It looks like it's going to be a huge chunk of change to do this migration, but at the end of the day, when all the dust settles, we can basically right size your environment for what you're actually consuming from a production standpoint, because we don't sell in, here is our tier one server package where you only have so many resources. A lot of public clouds tend to sell that way. And so if you are looking at it for a first time, private data centers tend to lean better to these larger migrations and implementations because you have that kind of flex resource pool. So if you are looking at doing a migration, definitely look at some of those because you can control your costs a little bit better, but you can also usually get a better performance boost because you can right size the environment. You don't have too much underhead or too much overhead as far as your resources go.
Very good. Very good. Well, I don't see any new questions coming in, so I think we'll probably wrap this up today. I want to thank you, Chris, for your time and for your input, and I want to thank all of our attendees for coming along with us. We can certainly send you this deck if you're interested in any more of that information. Of course, we have our contact information here. If you'd like to learn more about our offerings and services, please don't hesitate either to call or email or check out our website at estesgrp.com. And just wanted to thank you again for everything and have yourself a very fine weekend.